Syria, but also some of the statements he's made over the last few years calling into question whether the United States would be there if an ally fell under attack. So the bigger question is, what are we going to do about it? The French don't have any great answers as to how to remedy the erosion of U.S. leadership within NATO.
Let's bring in Pavel then. From Russia's perspective, Pavel, we've seen pretty positive comments on official tweets after we heard the comments from Macron, the French president, calling that a golden comment. Does Russia see that any sort of admission of the irrelevance of NATO, any crumbling or weakening of NATO, is a gain for Russia?
Well, NATO is seen as Moscow as a kind of eternal boogeyman. I mean, the concentration of anti-Russian sentiment and anti-Russian military power, the threat, and of course any kind of internal tensions and disagreements and inside NATO and the weakening of the transatlantic link between Washington and the European allies is always welcome. But there's also a kind of underlining to that if indeed NATO begins to crumble, that would not be good news for a lot of people in Moscow, to the military, to the intelligence community, defense industry, I mean, those who are called siloviki in Russia, because they have been using a NATO threat as a very important argument for bargaining for more money from the budget, increasing their role for internal propaganda and for internal intergovernmental discussions with the more liberal economic bloc of the government.
Right, but Pavel,
so
that might be the sentiment within some of the military industry within Russia, but from perhaps a more national perspective, a sort of national geopolitical perspective, is it mistaken to say that Putin is probably happy to see the sorts of voices being raised within NATO that say this organization may be irrelevant now?
Well, most likely, yes, but Putin has given, I don't know, daily briefings about the growing NATO threat at the same time by his intelligence people and the military, who are saying that NATO is very strong and creating new threats and new military units and threats appearing all the time. So it's a kind of double picture. And of course, it's not the first time that the French undermined NATO. Under President General Charles de Gaulle, they took France out of NATO, kicked NATO headquarters out of France and American bases out of France, and this was very welcome in Moscow at the time in the 60s. But, well, NATO didn't disappear. NATO has been in eternal different kind of types of crisis for a lot of time, as the European Union is. I mean, such an organization of so many states, there's all the time internal tensions. But it's not going away anytime soon, and that's maybe good for the siloviki in Moscow, too.
John, even if NATO is irrelevant, even if, as you said, it should have died with the end of the Cold War, is not the reality that Europe would form another kind of common defence mechanism?
Well, I think, yes, exactly. I think Macron may have asked some good questions, but I think he's given the wrong answers. I think he's asked a good question because, as I said earlier, he has identified the fact, both he and the people who've responded to him, that in reality NATO is nothing but a vector or a vehicle for American power. It's not in that sense an alliance. It's simply one in a long series in human history of hegemonic arrangements whereby one country dominates a whole series of others. And those other countries